And so now you all know them, act like you've known them for years. So when Leslie comes in, it shouldn't feel awkward.
Would you like to make a motion to recess into executive session for approximately 30 minutes to discuss pending litigation and possible claims involving the city pursuant to the exceptions set forth in KSA 75-4319B1 for consultation with attorneys for the city, which would be deemed privileged in the attorney-client relationship?
How about I second it?
Okay. The justification for the executive session is to keep attorney-client privilege matters confidential at this time. At the end of the executive session, the city commission will resume its regular meeting in the city commission room. So yes, we have started. We have a motion from the mayor, second from Commissioner Soden. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, 30 minutes. Steve, would you start the clock?
taxes that each person must pay. This video focuses specifically on property taxes. Second, as a Lawrence resident, you are a Lawrence property taxpayer, a Douglas County property taxpayer, a school district property taxpayer, and a state of Kansas property taxpayer. Third and finally, the City of Lawrence and Douglas and county to provide more efficient and effective services. If these services were individually provided by both the city and county, it would be much more expensive for everyone. Now let's jump into how property taxes and financial equity are linked in this collaborative environment. The city and county have funding agreements that outline the financial commitment that each entity has agreed upon. Unfortunately, we have agreements that when written, true financial equity was not necessarily a goal of the agreement and have not kept pace with scope and service level changes over time. These circumstances have contributed to inequitable financial contributions from City of Lawrence taxpayers. We're going to walk through two examples of funding agreements. In example 1, let's say the city and county agreed to each pay 50% for a service provided across Douglas County. This is an equal distribution.
I'm gonna turn it off now. Audio. I'm gonna pause this, bring it all the way back.
And it'll be super loud on TV.
Let's do this. I think that's the video. Those two. There's more ways. Just in case I need to do this. They want to. So there's your first. Either way it'll work. It's kind of doing redundancy.
Well, let's use, like I said, the city manager will start off.
I'll jump up and
So I'll let you get him started on that. Once we're done with the PowerPoint, then I come up and then.
Okay, so we got you all teed up. I'm not sure what else is happening.
I'd fire up and see if Chief Burns has something on the case.
Where's the step stool? Oh, there it is.
We have nothing to report.
Oh, okay.
So you want to take a little break?
Little break, just a quick break.
Yeah, we worked really hard in that executive session. We're going to take about a 5-minute break.
Sorry.
Session, we've come back from that. We have no recognitions or proclamations tonight. We do have the consent agenda. All matters listed below on the consent agenda are considered under one motion and will be enacted by one motion. There will be no separate discussion on those items. If discussion is desired, that item will be removed from the consent agenda and will be considered separately. Members of the public wishing to speak to an item that's been pulled off the consent agenda will be limited to 3 minutes for comments. Is there any issue that a member of the commission would like to remove from the consent agenda? Is there anything that a member of the public would like to remove from the consent agenda? Okay. Hearing none, I'd entertain a motion.
Move that we adopt the consent agenda, including all claims.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Herbert, second from Commissioner Ananda. All in favor?
Aye.
That's unanimous. Moving on to public comment. The public is allowed to speak to any items or issues except those scheduled on the consent agenda or regular agenda portions of the agenda after first being recognized by the mayor. Each person will be limited to 3 minutes for public comment. As a general practice, the commission will not discuss or debate these items, nor will the commission make decisions on items presented during this time. Rather, they will refer the items to staff for follow-up if necessary. Individuals are asked to come to the microphone, sign in, and state their name and address. Speakers should address all comments and questions to the commission. Public comment, general public comment. Okay. On to commission items. We have commission items this evening? Okay. City manager's report.
Well, no one's asked me what this little piece of cake here is all about, with a candle in it, but, and I'll have you take this over to the recipient.
All right.
But somebody's here celebrating her birthday this evening, and she's not here because, well, she's probably here because she wants to be, because that's what her employer would like to hear. But Rochelle is celebrating her birthday with us tonight. And I thought it'd be a nice idea that we had a little cake. She's away from her family. But I think, Stuart, as the mayor, you are to lead us in a rendition of Happy Birthday.
Okay, well, I'm going to move away from the microphone.
All right, just get us started. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Rochelle. Happy birthday to you.
Many more.
I had just a couple other items I wanted to announce, and I think you've seen the press release. Jeremy Wilmoth has accepted the position of finance director for the city, and you will see him starting November 19th. In addition, I want to announce that Danielle Bushcutter will be taking on a new position of budget and strategic initiatives manager. And I think we look forward to both of them taking over and starting with the priority-based budget. So very timely transition of personnel, and we look forward and we're excited about getting them started.
Congratulations.
Yes, congratulations.
And that's it.
That's it. Okay. Public comment on the city manager's report? Okay. Got our meeting list.
Do we have one added on yet for December at the end of the month? Which I'm presuming we'll have some.
A bill paying session.
I believe we reviewed the calendar, and Danielle, you can jump in here, but I think it's only 2 weeks, which we go 2 weeks, now that we only have 3 meetings a month, pretty regularly, so we think we can accommodate that without an additional meeting.
Okay.
So on the 17th was the community conversation on race issues. I know last time there were 3 of us there. Do we need to have that on the calendar?
It's on there now.
Is it?
Yes.
This Saturday at 10.
Set.
I'm not seeing it.
I don't see it on
It's
the
this
calendar.
second item under calendar.
You're on the wrong calendar. It's on the
November?
list. Go back to that.
Oh, down here?
Yeah.
Oh, down there.
It is on this calendar, it's not on
Not
our,
on the other calendar.
not on the other calendar.
Okay.
It's not on the,
Got it.
I'm sorry, I can't.
It's not on the actual calendar, it's listed as an event, but it's
Yeah,
not.
got it.
It's on the agenda.
It's on the agenda, yeah. Any other meetings or events?
I'll move we adjourn.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Soden, second from Commissioner Herbert. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Now we'll go on to the work session. The work session provides an opportunity for the City Commission to discuss items in greater detail. As a general practice, the Commission will not make decisions on items presented during this time. Rather, they will refer the items to staff for follow-up if necessary. Public comment related to work session topics will be allowed at the end of the discussion on each item. Each person will be limited to 3 minutes for public comment. Our first item.
So the first item tonight is a discussion of the fire medical services between the city fire department, emergency medical services department, and Douglas County. And so we're going to walk through a brief PowerPoint, and then we're going to have a number of individuals comment about the service and about some concerns that the city has with that. It's my understanding that the county is willing to sit down and discuss this agreement as probably the first agreement of a number of our collaborative efforts that we will be discussing with them. I'd say this is a little unique. This is a service, especially the emergency medical services, that is the entire responsibility of the county when it comes to paying for the service. So that is somewhat the language in there, and then it talks about 100% of capital equipment being the responsibility of the county as well. Sometimes, and I hear this in Lawrence and Douglas County somewhat on occasion, people from Lawrence don't recognize necessarily that they're in the county. And the reality is that 75% of the property tax funding for the county comes from the county that encompasses specifically the city of Lawrence. And then the remainder comes from the area in the county outside the city of Lawrence. And if you recall at last meeting, and the next slide will kind of get into this, I talked about the anomalies of some of the numbers that we deal with. And there's three that kind of center around 75-25 proportionality or splits. When you look at the property tax ratio for what is paid from the city, which is in the county, to the county budget for property taxes, it's about 75.07%. It's about 24.93% from areas outside the city that go to the county. Again, with this kind of a 75-25 split, the original agreement for the budget split between fire service and emergency medical services was 74% to the city and 26% to the county. That has subsequently changed. The original agreement, I think, was in 1996. That was amended in 1998, and so those numbers changed. I think it's now 75-25. So you can see that number keeps popping up. And if that weren't enough, there's another 75-25 kind of relationship in the breakout of things, calls for service ratio. 75% of the calls that our fire emergency medical services department receives are for emergency medical services calls, and 23% are for fire calls, the remaining 2% being coroner service-related type calls, as I understand that acronym. So the next We're going to play the two videos in terms of the whole equity issue that we've defined in that fashion regarding the agreements between the city and the county and how that all plays out in terms of those agreements, in terms of who's providing the funding, how the funding comes in. Again, the issue that we'll get into more specificity about is the fire emergency medical agreement tonight. And that's a little different because the ratio breakout is to address the agreement provisions that calls for the county to be paying 100% of the emergency medical services costs that are undertaken by the city's department. So the current number is I think 25% in that realm. And so, again, the question is, does that 25% really provide the 100%, okay? Is that really equate to the 100% of the cost for emergency medical services? So we will get into that. Interim chief will be here to discuss that along with one of the captains. And the city attorney will be addressing some of the legal issues about the agreement as well. And then we'll have an engagement about that back and forth. The plan is to have Diane Stoddard serve as the city's representative on the agreement meetings when we get those going. And it's my understanding that Sarah Plinsky, Assistant County Administrator, will be representing the county in those negotiations, or discussions, I should say. When we get to the actual, we don't think the number currently is 25%. We think it's more than that. But we have been, and we'll show you a couple of different ways that you could base the cost off on. But we're reluctant to say that's where we're honing in, because we think that there's value in sitting down and having the discussion with the county and listening to their perspective, and points and counterpoints are likely to be made in a discussion of this type. And things that we may see exclusively from our perspective, and they may see them in a different light. So when we walk through some of the different ratios that you'll see, for example, calls for service, how do those break out? We're going through our priority-based budget analysis, and that calls for a costing out of different departmental functions. And so we're getting very close to knowing what those costs should be. So we're going to get to that point where we should know what the 100% equates to. How much of our departmental budget makes up 100% for emergency medical? Now, why is that important? If it were entirely the county paying for it, as I showed you the ratio before, that would still mean that city taxpayers that pay county tax, which they all do, they would be providing 75% of that total if it were exclusively on property taxes. There may be other sources that they use. In fact, there are bills, fees for service that get charged through the emergency medical, help pay for that portion that is their responsibility. So all of that has got to be taken into consideration as we evaluate this. And again, the counterpoint that I think is expected to occur in this discussion will lead to, I hope, an understanding about what the number really should be. Now, having said that, the design, the goal of all of these discussions is not to break up the collaboration, but to make sure that we're living up to the terms of the agreement, and to make sure that the agreements are contemporary, that this agreement itself is 22 years old? A lot of these collaborative agreements have what's called a look-back feature. so that you're, every so often on an interim basis, you're taking a look back and running through the agreement to make sure that they have evolved, okay? And if they haven't, what needs to be changed? So whether this issue was being raised about cost or not, I think it would be a best practice for us to be looking at these agreements on an interim basis regardless. The other thing I'll remind you of is there was a discussion, and we talked about, well, what are the general parameters of how we should go about looking at all the collaborative efforts? Well, that's tough to try and sit there and have that conversation. That conversation in itself could take longer than it takes to get in and out of some of these agreements. And each one of these agreements has some unique characteristics. And I suspect that as we go through them, we will find maybe some consistent ways that we will figure out how to resolve how best to collaborate. The other thing I'd say about collaboration is there should be efficiency gains, okay, in terms of the services provided, who's providing them. And as those gains are established, not one party should achieve all those gains or the other. There should be some mutual benefit derived from that. In this particular case, though, I would remind you again, the county is obligated to pay the full cost of the operations of the emergency medical services and 100% of the capital equipment that's necessary to serve EMS. And I think the agreement still talks about capital equipment being equipment costing $5,000 or more. So that's probably not a relevant number anymore. Most people don't use that as capital equipment numbers. So I'm sure there's going to be other things as we open up these agreements that need to have evolved that have not. And so those will need to be updated. So with that, I'll ask that we start the
I have
video.
a question
Yeah.
real quick. What kind of guidance are you looking for us tonight?
Well, I'm exposing this to you in a public meeting because I think that it needs to be evaluated, and I want you to understand where we're headed. So at this point, all we're doing is explaining where we're coming from with this. We would ask that you acknowledge that the path we're on is the correct path in terms of heading down this direction to sit down and meet with the county. As I indicated, Diane is going to head up the team for the city, and Sarah is, my understanding, is going to head up the team for the county. Obviously, it will have to involve the fire service, the fire emergency medical service, because they'll be producing, the numbers, okay, that we need to know to determine what that cost should be. And they're the experts in how it's being operated and the functionality of the agreement and how that agreement then relates to the operations of the department. So it's my view that those parties at a minimum will be involved in this conversation.
Of a two-part series focusing on financial equity. This video will outline what financial equity is and walk through some funding scenarios. Before we can jump right in, there are a few basics that must be understood first because the concept of financial equity is complicated. First, there are a number of taxes that each person must pay. This video focuses specifically on property taxes. Second, as a Lawrence resident, you are a Lawrence property taxpayer, a Douglas County property taxpayer, a school district property taxpayer, and a state of Kansas property taxpayer. Third and finally, the City of Lawrence and Douglas County partner to provide several services. For example, the Fire Medical Department, Planning and Development Services, and the Health Department, among others. This partnership allows the city and county to provide more efficient and effective services. If these services were individually provided by both the city and county, it would be much more expensive for everyone. Now let's jump into how property taxes and financial equity are linked in this collaborative environment. The city and county have funding agreements that outline the financial commitment that each entity has agreed upon. Unfortunately, we have agreements that when written, true financial equity was not necessarily a goal of the agreement and have not kept pace with scope and service level changes over time. These circumstances have contributed to inequitable financial contributions from City of Lawrence taxpayers. We're going to walk through 2 examples of funding agreements. In example 1, let's say the city and county agreed to each pay 50% for a service provided across Douglas County. This is an equal distribution, but is it equitable? Before we can answer this question, it is important to understand that the City of Lawrence makes up 75.07% of the total taxable value in Douglas County. This means that if the county were to pay for a service that impacted all of those within Douglas County, Lawrence taxpayers would fund 75.07% of the service. In other words, for every property tax dollar spent by Douglas County, 75.07 cents comes from Lawrence taxpayers. Now let's go back to our financial equity question. If the city and county each pay 50% for a service, is it equitable? In order to answer this, we're going to have to walk through the math. For the sake of easy numbers, we are going to look at a service that costs $1 million. In this example, the city would pay 50% of that, or $500,000, and the county would pay the other, $500,000. But remember, we just noted that Lawrence taxpayers make up 75.07% of the taxable valuation. Therefore, Lawrence taxpayers are responsible for $375,360 of the county portion, and non-Lawrence taxpayers are responsible for the remaining $124,640 of the county portion. This means that when the city and county decide to split costs 50-50, the total tax burden on Lawrence taxpayers is 87.54% of the cost of service, in this case $1 million. Now, let's look at what an equitable distribution looks like. When there is no city and county split, the tax burden for Lawrence taxpayers is $750,720, and the tax burden for non-Lawrence taxpayers is $249,280. You will notice that these dollar amounts align with the taxable valuation. Now let's compare the total tax burden for Lawrence taxpayers when there is a 50-50 funding split and when there is no funding split. The total tax burden for Lawrence taxpayers was $875,360 when funding was split 50-50. The total tax burden for Lawrence taxpayers was $750,720 when there was no funding split. This means there is a $124,640 shift in the tax burden from non-Lawrence taxpayers to Lawrence taxpayers in example 1, where there is a 50-50 funding split between the city and county. This means that Lawrence taxpayers are subsidizing a service for non-Lawrence taxpayers, such as those located in Baldwin City, Eudora, Lecompton, and unincorporated Douglas County. While not all the city and county funding agreements are financially equitable, there are still efficiencies of operations gained through collaboration. The city hopes to revisit some agreements to help improve the financial equity and continue to partner with the county to provide equitable services to all Douglas County taxpayers. Please check out our second video in this 2-part series where we outline how we can achieve better financial equity.
Migraine trigger. The whole video is a migraine trigger. Let's not use those templates anymore, okay? And Tom, do you want to jump into this second one right away?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Welcome back to part 2 of this 2-part series on financial equity. The first video established that there are inequitable financial contributions from City of Lawrence taxpayers. But now let's talk about why this is important and how it can be addressed moving forward. It is important for a few reasons. First, it means that City of Lawrence taxpayers are subsidizing services for those located in Baldwin City, Eudora, Lecompton, and unincorporated Douglas County, and does not achieve the goal of being financially equitable for all those within Douglas County. Additionally, when funding splits occur, it can lead to administrative dysfunction and lack of consistent leadership. Finally, it can be difficult to manage these programs when each agency plays a different role and those roles are not communicated effectively or clearly defined. There are a number of different funding agreements between the city and county, and this means that achieving financial equity will likely take years. However, it is also important to remember that even when true financial equity is not achieved, there are still efficiencies gained when agencies are able to partner together to provide services. Now let's talk about how to address financial equity moving forward. Each funding agreement is a little different and will have a varied level of impact. Due to the number of agreements, there will have to be an incremental approach taken to review these agreements. The city recognizes that changing some of these funding agreements is going to result in a shift of costs, and that those will need to be budgeted for and communicated to a number of different agencies. The goal is to start with the larger agreements that will result in the most cost shift and provide a reasonable timeline for implementation so that all agencies can be prepared for the shifts in costs. Finally, it is important to remember that while this video series focuses specifically on property taxes, the city does also receive sales tax, which often come from those that live outside the city. Those proceeds help pay for services that visitors use or have the ability to use while they are in Lawrence. Some of these services include public safety, such as police, fire, EMS, our transportation networks, parks, recreation opportunities, and infrastructure, such as our streets, water, sewer, and multi-use paths. Lawrence is able to support the environment for businesses to prosper and attract visitors. The city hopes to be able to continue to partner with the county and other organizations in a financially equitable manner, and to revisit some agreements to ensure that they are equitable to all those within Douglas County. Thank you for watching our two-part series on financial equity.
So at this point, we'll have Sean Coffey and Tom Fagan come forward and give their report.
Mayor, Commissioners, I'm Sean Coffey. I'm currently serving as the interim fire chief. This is Division Chief Tom Fagan, who's in charge of our administrative division. And so we'd like to go into a little bit more information related to the agreement and maybe give you some background. First start out with fire medical services in the county. I think it's important for everybody to have a clear understanding. We provide EMS to the entire Douglas County. That means the city of Lawrence, the city of Eudora, Baldwin, Lecompton, and all the unincorporated areas in Douglas County. We also provide hazardous materials response. That's an agreement that we have with the county as well, and the county provides a funding source of about $60,000 annually to support us in that hazardous materials response. We're the entity in charge of any hazardous materials incident within Douglas County. We also provide technical rescue services within Douglas County. So what is technical rescue? Technical rescues are confined space type rescues, high angle, trench rescues, building collapse. But the two big ones that we see often going out into the county is water rescue and extrications. Those services aren't currently identified within the agreement for any type of reimbursement or compensation, and we do provide those services out in the county. We'll run out to the southwest part of the county, we'll run to other cities, we'll have our rescue truck respond out and provide extrication along with the 3 personnel that are on that. We think it's an integral service that we provide, but there is nothing in the agreement that addresses support for that. Additionally, we have the corner scene services. Additionally, we have the corner scene services. That's a program we have with Douglas County. That's in support to the coroner service. We have 6 individuals that receive an incentive that provide that, and there's been some substantial changes in that program as well. And then last thing on there is fire suppression. We only provide fire suppression within the city limits of Lawrence. With exception, we have a contract with Grant Township just north of here on the city limits. But other than that, fire suppression just in the city. We will respond out if requested by mutual aid to the township fire departments. The fire suppression only in the city.
Could you explain fire suppression?
Fire suppression, so fire extinguishment, fire services, so structure fire responses, lift assists. What other type of calls would we classify as fire suppression?
Anything fire, car fires,
Okay,
grass
Fire-
fires,
Dumpster fires, building fires.
okay, thanks.
Okay.
farm regulations.
Maybe the arrow.
I know there's an, okay, the down arrow, thank you. I'll do that next time. So, fire medical assistant services in the county continue. This is a map that shows Douglas County and shows where our location of our EMS services are within Douglas County. Within the city limits, you see 5 stations that we provide 5 ALS transport units. We additionally have a medic unit in the city of Baldwin that covers the southern half of the county. And then we have a medic unit in Eudora that covers the eastern edge of the county. Remember, we believe this is a system approach to EMS. So those units that are in Baldwin and Eudora, if we run low on medic units within the city, based upon risk, we'll move those into the city. If the unit in Baldwin happens to be gone on a call and we get a call out in the southwest part of the county out by the lake, we'll send medic unit 4 from Wakarusa and Clinton Parkway. We'll send that to the southwest part of the county. So it's an EMS system. So we move those units around based upon risk within our community. Okay, which one am I missing?
Should just be a little bit down here, I think. I'm gonna keep it.
So the agreement history. So they picked the guy with the greatest mustache, I think, to talk a little bit about this. I was around back in 1996. At that time, we were operating 4 fire stations within the city of Lawrence. And in those fire stations, 3 of them had what we call double company houses. We had an engine and a squad company in them, or a ladder company. And then 1 station just had an engine in it. So 4 fire stations operating within the city. Douglas County Ambulance at that time had 3 medic units operating out of 2 stations. 2 of them units were operated out of 225 Main, and 1 of them was operated out of 19th and Mass, where we're currently operating a medic unit right now while Station 1 is being renovated. And that's how we provided those separate services within it. As you can see, our original budgets, the fire departments was about 5.2 million, DCAS 1.8, and so that total roughly $7 million for the budget. When you look at those numbers, that 74% and that 26%, as the city manager indicated, you'll see that come back up here in a couple of slides as we talk about the agreement. So this consolidation was an important thing. I apologize.
You can use the side arrows. That might be faster than up and down.
I'll try to figure it out here. I apologize. So this consolidation, as the city manager talked, was really an important thing for the entire county, city and county. We consolidated, and as soon as we consolidated, we were able to put 4 ambulances in service deployed throughout the city strategically in the stations. Prior to that, they had 3 ambulances, and they were at 225 Main and 19th and Mass. So we were able to get 4 stations immediately staffed with ALS units that were able to respond. As part of that agreement, we also opened a new station in Baldwin on January 1st, 1998, so giving us 5 units to provide ALS service to cover the entire county, including the city of Lawrence, Baldwin, Lecompton, Eudora. So it's a really good thing. We were able to provide better ALS care to our service people. You know, prior to this agreement, when I was on the fire department, we did not first respond. Law enforcement were the first responders. So an example of this, I always tell everybody, one time I was standing at 19th and Haskell at the fire station there, and an ambulance came by. Came by and went right across the street in an apartment complex. Later on, we found out, we didn't know about it because we weren't dispatched those calls. There was a child not breathing. But we didn't do any EMS calls. After the merger, we had an ambulance right in that station, and we had the resources to send immediately to be able to provide EMS care. And so when we talk about EMS care and why a fire truck goes, obviously if somebody's not breathing and the ambulance is gone, we want to be able to send resources to that person as quickly as possible to intervene. So after the agreement, we were able to have those 4 stations, and then in January 1st of 1998, the city of Baldwin opened.
Chief, try that side arrow. See
Go
if
ahead,
it-
show me what you're talking
I don't know
about.
if it'll work or not. There we go.
So related to the agreement, 1996, December of 1996, financial obligations, Section 5. Really, this is where they came up with the cost analysis, and I talked about a couple slides ago. You looked at that 24% and 26%. Really, the initial agreement was really based upon what those initial budgets were. It wasn't really based upon the provision of EMS. It was just, hey, this is the budget, and this is what we're going to do. There was that collaboration where we won, where we were able to get more units in service to be able to provide that EMS care quickly to the community. But it wasn't based upon the provision of EMS. Really, I believe it was just based upon those budgetary numbers. So within Section 5A, and this is where the city manager talked about, it says in the agreement, it says, it shall be the obligation of the county to finance all costs associated with the provision of ambulance service to the entire county, including within the city of Lawrence. And so when we talk about this agreement, this is something we're referring back to. Also in the agreement, it talked about capital obligations, $5,000 or greater. Currently in the agreement, anything that's fire-related, per the agreement, the city pays 100%. So you buy a new fire truck, the city pays 100% of it. You buy a new ambulance, the city pays 100% of it. We have this in place, but over time, that's been a little bit of a change, and there has been efforts to provide additional support through the capital programs, but it's not written down in the agreement. In the past, the county has assisted with the building of Fire Station number 5, the remodel of Station number 1, as well as the new training tower we're getting. But none of that's put in writing on that agreement. Also, those agreements, when they come about on the capital for the participation by the county, it's all based upon projected cost, not actual cost. And so I think that's something within the agreement we probably ought to look at a little bit more closely and define. Fees for service. The city and the county will jointly establish fees for service for EMS. And we'll set those rates, and we'll probably be coming back to you before the end of the year to have that discussion as it relates to the rates. It's our responsibility to do the collection of all the user fees. We collect those fees, and then we pay those fees back to the county. And that part of that goes back to the 25.64% that they estimate for the cost of the service. So we collect, we let the county know how much each quarter, how much to invoice us, and they invoice us for the user fees, and we return that money to the county. In 1998 of October, there was an amendment made to the agreement, and I think this talks a little bit about where we were organizationally within the community. In 1998, actually it was in 1999, beginning of 99, the city added 6 additional firefighters within the city. I think at that time the understanding was that the city's adding additional firefighters. That's the cost the city's incurring, increasing their budget. It's going to reduce the county share. So there was a change made, and it went from that 76 to 24 to 75 25. Now we all realize in this day and age, hey, a firefighter, they do fire and EMS. Our people get on the truck, and if they're on the fire truck and a medical call comes out across the street, they go across the street and initiate ALS care. If the next day they're on a medic unit and a fire comes in across the street, they're bunking up, getting their bunker gear on, their SCBAs, and they're going to work fighting fire across the street. So now we do things commonly. I think it was just a little different time, but that was one of the reasons for the adjustment, I believe, from that 75 to 25. Also at that time, there was a revision in how the reimbursement came back to the city. It was done on a quarterly basis. But in 1998, they went ahead and changed that a little bit. They said that on the quarterly basis, we're going to reimburse them for the revenue that we collected. And then the difference between that and the 25.64, whatever that number was, they're going to divide that up into 12 monthly payments and reimburse us on those 12 monthly payments. So then 2000, the last time that we updated the agreement. All right, within the agreement they changed where it used to say the percentages in there, and it just indicated that we had established those jointly. So in 2000, the city and county came together on a joint agreement and set the new rates at 74.36% and 25.64%. And I'll be honest with you, I don't have any background on why those changed and what those differences were. And I think that's one of the things to come forward 18 years it's time to probably look back to see where we should be moving this forward. Also, at that time, it was changed from the deputy director to the director to report to the county administrator or the county commission as it related to EMS provision within the county EMS services. So the last 20 years, when we look at our output for EMS, all right, currently for EMS, we're running about 9,500 calls a year, fire 2,800, CSI 226 calls a year. The thing about that CSI I want to point out, the year after we first merged and had the consolidation, we ran what we call 77 CSI calls. And now we're up to 226, and if you talk to some other people, they say it's more like 226. That was an innovative program that was developed by DCAS, and then we took it on within the consolidation to provide assistance to the coroner. It's a great program, but unfortunately it's a model that doesn't work the way we operate right now. With the increase in call volume and the demand on the system, really we need to maybe look at a new model for our CSI program and work in conjunction with the county to come up with a new model that might be more effective for everybody. Also, just projecting out, we're looking at about 13,555 calls in 2018. And Chief Fagan tells me it's even going to be a bigger number than that. So how do we figure out what that cost is? One of the things that Chief Fagan and I did, we did a lot of investigation to try to see what other services and how they generate this cost for service for EMS. One of the things about Lawrence, obviously, we're unique. We're a unique community in many aspects. But we are a fire-based EMS, and if you surrounding areas, there's not anybody that has it. The closest model we found within Kansas was Salina. And so we were pretty happy with that. Oh, we'll go out there and get some good insight to see how they're doing it. But after we returned from there, they had a little bit different model as well. What they do is they receive a tax money from the county. It's not an ad valorem tax. And then they receive that payment from the county, and then any revenue that's generated from the EMS calls all stays within the city. So it's a little bit different model. So we were trying to find different ways to do it. Chief Fagan's been working diligently along with Rachel Palmer on our priority-based budgeting system that we're moving to for 2020. And so we put this model into place, and as you look at this, you'll see that emergency medical services really came out with a cost of $7,375,000. And then fire suppression behind that. And so really as we move forward, you can imagine that's our highest demand. And so it's really, as you look at this, it's cost allocation based on demand. EMS being our highest demand, we put our most resources, which are our people, into meeting that demand. And so that's why that number puts it at the top. Additionally, you also probably have to figure into that cost ambulance billing that's highlighted there, our EMS division administration, as well as coroner services and tactical medics. But in reality, if you look at many of those programs there, all those things touch upon really the cost to provide an EMS service, fire-based EMS. Additionally, other costs that aren't included in the agreement because they aren't part of our budget are certain things like facilities maintenance costs, finance related to finance, fleet, human resources, legal, risk management, technology, all those things that support our efforts to provide this service out there. None of those are part of the agreement. And so when you look at that for the last 20 years, the city's been incurring that cost as we go, and it hasn't in any way addressed in the agreement. That's one way you might look at the cost for EMS. Another way would be to look at the output ratio. The city manager talked a lot about this. And if you look at our EMS calls versus fire and CSI, and you look at those numbers there, and you see 16 million for EMS, 5 million for fire. Now, I think we talked about the consolidation and the benefits gained by that. One of the things I would tell you is that there's no way, I believe, that we could put, if we said we weren't going to do EMS, which we don't want to do, but we could not fund our fire department for $5 million. That was the number from 1996 they had on the budget at that point. So it's probably not a true number, but it gives us a basis to work from. The big thing out of this, when I look at the incident cost output ratio, I think about that 25.64, and I don't have a identified number to say, we need, $1 million more, $2 million more. It's not that easy. I think that we're really going to have to look at some indicators to try to define more closely what we need. But I know it's greater than the 25.64% that we're currently paying. All right, Chief Fagan's going to talk a little about the exchange of funds and cost. You've heard me talk a little bit about that some of this is done on a quarterly basis, some of it's done on a monthly basis. There's also some fees that the city pays for and the county pays for. So Chief Fagan's going to talk a little bit about that.
As we were looking at the agreement, being that we would be potentially looking at areas for efficiencies gained as well, really for both sides, following a review. In the cost recovery portion where there is a monthly exchange of monies and there is also that quarterly exchange. And so we talked about the user fees, ambulance user fees specifically. And so there are several processes back and forth ultimately where there's an opportunity for efficiency to be gained to really streamline the exchange of monies in a review of processes as far as the exchange of costs. So I think that's another opportunity when we look at the agreement to look at the exchange of funds and costs for efficiencies and streamlining the process. I believe that the way it's currently set up creates an opportunity for errors to occur. Lots of human processes there where there could be efficiencies gained. Also, there are city expenses and county expenses. As we look at invoices that are coming in, if they are specific to the program of EMS, we have to identify the county of that invoice and send it over to them. We also have city and county purchasing cards for certain expenses as well. So those are all different processes that complicate the operation where there may be opportunities to revise that or at least look at that for the details within the next agreement. Chief, do you want to talk about Eudora?
So a little bit about Eudora. In the original, when we talked about it originally, we had the 4 stations. We added Baldwin. Since the time, the city's added another fire station in the city, and now we have 5 within the city. In 2017, in addition to the 5 within the city and the Baldwin station, this county added the Eudora ambulance agreement. And that was to get that ambulance on the east side of the county to provide service not only to the east side of the community, but to Eudora as well. Per the agreement, the county has that ability to add additional resources if they so desire. And they did, and part of that agreement was the county took on 100% of the financial obligations for that. So there's staffing of 8 people that the county pays for, plus they pay for all the costs associated with that. They reimburse us on a quarterly basis once again, and on the 4th quarter, then they actually come down and get the actual cost for those 8 people. And it's about $945,000 a year that the county provides for that. That's outside of the 25.64 that they pay. So when we talk about that number, you have to realize the county does pay for other services. For this, I'll call it $1 million for a round number. They also pay for all of our consumable medicals, and they pay for CSI, and they also pay for 3 billing positions we have within the fire medical department. So why I bring up Eudora a little bit is I want to bring it up as an example comparative to the Baldwin City Station. I told you Baldwin City was part of the original agreement, and that it was part of the 25-75 agreement, 74-26 originally, and now part of the 25.64, 74.36 agreement. Right now, I indicated to you that Baldwin's paid for 100% by the county. If we go back to the video that we started with that Danielle created, when we talk about that agreement, as you can see within the Eudora station, they talk about that equitable share in the city taxpayers. So obviously Lawrence taxpayers, the county's paying for all that, everybody's kind of paying an equal share of that. But when we go back to the Baldwin example, it goes back to that, I'll use 75-25%. In that, the staffing levels in Baldwin are covered by the agreement, the 25.64, the agreement there. And so the city's paying roughly 75% of that cost. The county's paying 25%. And if you look at that pie chart on the right, you see that we're paying 75%, but then we're also paying 75% of the 25% in that agreement. versus Eudora, where everything's paid 100%.
Yeah, Chief, do the cities of Baldwin or the cities of Eudora, as a city government, provide any funding?
No, they do not. In the city of Eudora, they do provide a location. We are staffed inside the city of Eudora station, so they do provide a facility for us there. Where we're staffed in Baldwin is a location provided by Douglas County. It's a house that we renovated into a station.
Is there a reason why these, the models were different for the two cities?
I believe at the time they were looking at wanting to get additional staffing in Eudora. I think there's, the county might be able to add that and give us more detail, but I think the city of Eudora was wanting more presence from the medical side of it, and the county commission agreed to support that effort to have an additional medic unit on the east side of town and provide 100% of the cost of it.
So that's a separate agreement altogether?
That is a separate agreement, yes, sir.
Okay.
Do we have numbers? I know in Danielle's video, it talked specific to Lawrence as a 75.07% representation of revenue. Do we have what those numbers are for Eudora and Baldwin? So when we talk about, for instance, 100% of the Eudora station is paid for by Douglas County, what would be Eudora's portion of that in terms of the taxable revenue?
You know, I don't know. We could probably check on that and find that out. We'd have to find out what the population of Eudora
Right.
would be, or Baldwin, and kind of come up with that number.
Okay.
So that would be in that non-Lawrence taxpayers part of the pie chart on the left, right?
Well, but it would be a smaller
Be a
piece of
smaller
that.
piece of it, yeah.
That's what I'm trying to
Yeah.
find, you know,
They represent about 3.19% of the value.
So it'd be about an eighth of that 24%.
So roughly 97% of the Eudora station then is paid for by people not living in Eudora.
Yeah, that's not really our point.
I know,
Right,
I'm just
but-
trying
I
to
mean-
gather.
Right.
But the thing is, you're providing services around the county from that point. You're
Yes.
not just,
Yeah,
it's not
just the city of
specifically to Eudora.
Yeah. And remember, like I said, we talked about it as a system approach. We'll draw that unit out of Eudora into the city
Yeah.
if we're running low. Also, if a unit's gone out of Baldwin, we get a Eudora, and we get a medical call there, we'll send a unit to Eudora as well.
Actually, I would argue that they're paying their fair share in that regard.
Yeah.
The situation in Baldwin is very different, though, and that's been in existence for how long?
Since the inception of the
Yeah.
agreement.
So that goes back to that original formula, which is, when you talk about the 100%, the facility in Eudora is 100% medical?
The facility we're in with the Eudora Fire Station, yeah, fire station there.
And
Yes.
so who's paying the fire end of it?
The city of Eudora.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's really what I was asking when I said, does the city of Eudora fund? So the city of Eudora does fund their own fire service,
Yes.
just not, okay.
Just not the EMS. They
Is
do
the
have
same
some-
true, is the same true in Baldwin City?
Yes.
Okay.
But you can see the significant difference in the approach
Correct.
to these
Yeah.
things, where the Baldwin facility is costing the city of Lawrence a lot more than it would in the same example if Eudora model were used in Baldwin City, it would cost us a lot less.
Some of the joining agreements with this, we have the Douglas County Ambulance Service Charge, I brought that up, where we have that. Medical Director, that's paid for, that's another agreement. The county funds the Medical Director position at 100%. Douglas County First Responders, we're actually currently working with that. That's an agreement between the first responders and Douglas County, but we're involved in it. And some of the training, some of the supervision of the calls, QA and that type of thing. Douglas County EMS claims. Douglas County does provide 3 positions, funding for 3 billing people within our organization. And then we saw the Douglas County Emergency Communications Center agreement, where the city provides 66% of the funding for Douglas County Emergency Communications Center. Those are some of the joining agreements that are out there, along with the Eudora agreement. So recommendations, we want to pursue a more equitable financial obligations based on the provision of EMS services. And we looked at a couple different models. I think there's more work to drill down to find out what that actually is. We want to incorporate clearer language for capital obligations to make sure we just have a clear picture on what everybody's paying for and whether it's projected or actual cost. We want to review the corner scene investigator program. We don't think that the current model is really workable within our current organizational scope and needs.
Isn't the coroner someone from Johnson County?
It's a coroner service that the county contracts with, and they're out of, Topeka or out of Johnson County now? Johnson County? Kansas City, Kansas, Frontier Forensics.
So we don't have our own Douglas County one? They're not dedicated to Douglas County?
No, there's not, yes. All right, we want to review the provision of technical rescue within the county. We talked about that response out, providing that extrication and water rescue, plus the less infrequent ones. Minimize the exchange of monies to reduce errors. Chief Fagan talked a little bit about that. It's fairly comprehensive, and I think all of us would like to see some greater clarity in that. And then talk about the governance of the administration for whom the fire chief reports. Just a little bit of clarity on that. Sometimes within two organizations you're receiving some directives, and I think clearer line of governance would be important on that. I think Tony's going to provide some updates, and we'll come back for questions.
Good evening, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm Tony Wheeler, the City Attorney. I was asked to give an overview of the agreements that we have in place, and I apologize, there's a little bit of duplication from the presentation that Chief Coffey made, but my presentation is sort of tracks the arrangement or the organization of the agreements that we have in place. So the cooperation agreement was executed in December of 1996. It was amended twice in 1998 and in 2000. The agreement merged the county EMS service with the Lawrence Fire Department to form one department of the city that provides EMS service countywide and fire services in the city. The agreement provided for the transfer of county employees to city employment. The original agreement had the deputy director of the department, the combined department, serve as the liaison to the county, and the county administrator. But in 2000, the amendment replaced that with the fire chief. So the fire chief now acts as the liaison with the county. The original agreement also provided for the county to have a role in reviewing agreements and some participation by county staff in discussions with the employee organization, the IAFF. It set forth the financial obligations of the city and the county on and after the merger, including the timing of certain transfers of funds between the city and county, and the chief has gone over those. I'll just summarize again. It called for the city and the county to jointly budget for operation costs with the city originally paying 74% of the total department budget and the county paying 26%. In 1998, an amendment changed those percentages. 74% was the responsibility of the city, and the county, 75% was the responsibility of the city, and 25% was the responsibility of the county. Then in 2000, the amendment provided for the establishment by joint resolution the percentages going forward. And the 2000 joint resolution that was adopted then set the percentages at 74.36% for the city and 25.64% for the county. The resolution that was adopted in 2000 further provides that those rates established by the joint resolution are to remain in effect until amended by a new joint resolution adopted by the city and the county. No new resolution has come forward, so we remain at those percentages. The agreement sets forth the parties' financial obligations, and under the agreement, the county is obligated to finance all costs associated with ambulance services for the entire county. The original agreement made the county responsible for 100% of the cost to add or replace vehicles or other capital equipment used primarily for ambulance service or ambulance purposes. This requirement was removed in the 2000 amendment. The county is responsible for 100% of the costs associated with the building and maintaining of buildings for the ambulance service, and the county agrees to pay for coroner field services pursuant to a program that they established. The city financial obligations included the city was to finance all costs for fire prevention and suppression in the city. The city is to pay 100% for the replacement or addition of vehicles and other capital equipment used primarily for fire protection purposes. And the city agrees that department personnel will provide the coroner field services pursuant to the county program. There are joint city and county financial obligations under the agreement, and one of them is to determine the level of emergency services that are to be provided under the agreement. The original agreement also provided that if, in the determination of the Board of County Commissioners, the department fails to consistently provide adequate EMS service in areas of Baldwin City, Eudora, Lecompton, and the unincorporated area, that is adequate grounds for amendment or termination of the agreement. And likewise, if in the judgment of the City Commission, the county fails to adequately finance EMS services in the city, then that would be grounds for amendment or termination of the agreement. The agreement also provides that the city and the county are to cooperate in the collection of fees for EMS services, and the fees are to be established jointly by resolution, by a joint resolution or ordinance. And the city collects those fees, as the chief reported, and deposits those with the county treasurer. The original agreement did call for an ambulance to be stationed in Baldwin City, and the agreement also provided for the transfer of certain county emergency property to the city, including vehicles, equipment, and buildings. The agreement also has a termination provision. Either party can terminate the agreement by giving written notice to the other party. The written notice must be provided by July 1 of any year, but it is not effective, the termination is not effective until the following January. And then the contract has a number of just standard contractual provisions, that it will be governed by Kansas law, and those types of things. So that is the overview of the agreement and the amendments.
Tony?
Yes.
I'm curious about the legal obligations. The city has an obligation to provide fire suppression services within the city limits. That's just what our role as a city is. Are we also required to provide medical services as a city? Or I'm trying to understand the role of the county in providing medical services.
Under the agreement, the county is to provide medical services countywide, including within the jurisdiction of the city, through this merged department.
Okay. If we had no agreement, who would be responsible for providing medical services in the city?
At the time of the agreement, the county was providing the emergency medical services, so.
Right.
And there is, when you read the agreements, there's discussions of licensure that had occurred at the time as to the provision of services. So, you know, I suppose you could assume the responsibility for the residents of the city.
Yeah.
You certainly can't assume the responsibility outside without cooperation from the county to do that.
Yeah.
But if in fact you were to revert, I think a very strong argument could be made that the county would resume and have responsibility, especially if they're going to use taxes to do it, whereas 75% of the money's coming from the city.
Okay. Well, I mean, I just trying to understand the source of all this stuff.
It's always good to go back to the source documents.
Yes. Yeah. So, but the essential facts are the city is responsible for fire suppression services, and the county is responsible for emergency medical services.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we gave a lot of numbers. I just want to reiterate that the issue from our standpoint is that 25, 26% the correct number? Because if it isn't, then there's been a burden shift to the city that we're paying more than what we should on a proportion basis. And the service has changed. You know, with with or without the acknowledgement of the county in an active, discussion of those things, they have been the recipient of the the benefits of a much improved service. All these things have changed. It's really just time to sit down and go through this agreement again and define what that total cost actually is.
How do you see that process working?
Well, I have a lot of confidence in Diane to be able to lead the team for the city, and I'm sure that her counterpart at the county has the same acumen to be able to bring to bear her team in terms of analysis, the numbers, the interpretation of the agreement, so that all that gets hammered out. But like I said, the chief and I both believe that the number that's currently there does not reflect the 100%. And so we need to come up with that number. But rather than put that number hard up on a wall someplace based on some argument, which we could do, it seems more appropriate to get into a point-counterpoint and see how you can get that resolved. I think the other thing that's realistic, if it were to double, that burden shift would be pretty substantial. And so I think in terms of correcting something like that should, we should consider phasing that to some degree. Even though that extends the burden on the city, it's certainly in the right direction, and I think eventually we would get there to what the correct number is. But those things we kind of left to the actual sit-down and letting the people kind of hammer out the language. But who pays is critical. And that's the essence of this conversation, and what that fair distribution is.
And it's important that we have those conversations rather than just saying, well,
Do you plan on bringing in the city of Eudora and the city of Baldwin City to this conversation?
I certainly think they should be invited into the conversation. I think that at least they should be able to observe the conversation. The two principals are the county and the city, though, to this agreement.
I have a question. I'm having a hard time understanding. The agreement says that the county is 100% responsible for EMS, but then it also says that the city will pay 75% of the budget and the county will pay 24% of the budget, or 25%. So if they're 100% responsible, why are we paying anything?
Because the budget they're referring to is the total budget for both fire
For both.
and emergency medical services.
And
That's
it's-
the contextual, you can get all hung up on not just the anomalies of the numbers, but the language itself. But the context there is referring to the total budget for both fire, EMS, coroner services, critical, emergency issues, all of that.
But to clarify, it's the fire for the city of Lawrence, not for the volunteer companies in other parts of the county.
That's correct.
So
That's correct.
it's that fire services for the city of Lawrence and EMS services for the entire county.
And, when you go back to the construct of the agreement, they needed to use something, okay? What they used was the respective budgets of each. Of the county's EMS, they used that number, and they used the city's fire service as our number. Those approximated that proportion of 75-25. Those were the numbers they used. And I question whether anybody really did on our part. And if you think about it, the burden was on us, okay, to evaluate those numbers and determine what the fair proportion was. But the language that I think trumps all here is that they're obligated, the county is, for the 100% or the full cost, I think is the language, of the EMS service. The full cost of that. So we need to figure out what model you use in determining full cost. Having been involved in a number of these collaborations, sometimes the cost modeling gets into excruciating detail as to what cost items do apply, what don't apply to that proportional breakout. Here we used what was handy. And that, in my opinion, may have led to maybe a burden shift of who's paying for that. I don't think there's any doubt there was a burden shift.
Other questions?
Well, it sounds like we wouldn't necessarily be limited to looking at a percentage of the budget of fire and EMS, but looking at a more equitable distribution based on actual costs.
Yeah, I think those are two examples of how you could approach it, but a lot of times what they do is they do a budget, and then they do an actual at the end of the year, and then they make an adjustment so that it is very, it's to the, as close as you can get to the penny as you can. They do a very costed approach to those things. I don't know if this is where this one will go. Again, my belief is we're clearly better combining the services. This is not about trying to break it up. That's not in my mindset at all. I think it should continue. My mindset is we need to get back to what 100% of the cost is that the county is supposed to be paying. And we don't believe that's 25, 26, or something even close to that. We believe it's higher than that.
As for the projected versus the audited model, I just like to make sure that when you're discussing that in the future, that the cost of auditing, don't outpace the gains.
Regardless of all the other discussions we've had, that's an item that I think, I don't know who mentioned it, the chief probably. There's overhead typically, okay? There's management beyond, the personnel just in the fire service that deal with a lot of these issues. There's purchasing personnel that work on different things for them. All of that overhead is typically not charged back to the fire service. There's IT people that work on things, all of those things. When we assumed that responsibility, I'm not sure it was contemplated that overhead reimbursement was a part of this, but understand that's there. And is it is it the same as proportionate? We'd probably have many of the same people doing some of those things. So it's a marginal impact. It's not a full, in my opinion, distribution impact, but I see us as being, as a community, being very generous to other parts of the county in how this has been costed over the years.
I would hope we look at, as well, bringing the coroner in-house perhaps. We have a very professional department, so I think that would be really helpful to the department perhaps. The department.
I think there's some statutory provisions on that kind of control, so.
Other questions? Okay. Do we have public comment on this issue? Sure.
Just a few quick comments, if I can have time. Again, my name is Seamus Halberton. I'm speaking as a citizen as well as an elected representative of 120 firefighters, EMTs, and paramedics of the International Association of Firefighters, Local 1596. I would first like to just quickly and publicly thank the executive staff of Lawrence Douglas County Fire Medical for their hard work on preparing their presentation, as well as the work they're doing on this issue. Again, we fully support the reevaluation of this agreement and any pursued changes that have the potential to improve the safety of the community. Seems like we're headed down that right path. Our only ask of the commission is that they take this project very seriously because it has the potential to affect the generations of Lawrence citizens as it did with the decisions made in the 90s. And by the questions you guys are asking, it's apparent that you're already taking that mindset. You know, as an organization, we truly believe that people make their decision on where they want to live, spend their lives, raise families, and spend their money based on two factors, one being quality of schools, the other being the safety of the community. And this project directly correlates with that issue. And we would just like to remind the commission about the presentation made by the executive staff earlier in the year that notes that our emergency crews have become much busier, our population has increased, stations' response districts are growing, and it is becoming more and more difficult for our crews to meet not only internal benchmarks, but those benchmarks set by national standards. This, of course, is meaning that it is becoming harder and harder for the city's firefighters to provide the level of safety that the citizens deserve as well as expect. Basically, you know, as they noted, and some of the data the chiefs provided, we're headed down a path where we're going to be understaffed and under-equipped pretty quickly. And these are not opinions, but backed up by department documents, 2017 Standard to Cover study, as well as a 2018 strategic plan, and all the quantitative data collected over the past decade, as well as the third-party experts that helped produce those documents. And as the commission noted during last week's meeting, we should be trusting our experts. We're simply asking that you guys look at this as an opportunity to find a way to staff that additional fire station that is needed in the northwest corner, as well as to infill our busy stations in downtown districts and like so. Currently, I see right now that the additional station sits on the capital improvement plan for 2022. I understand this is a very large project, and it may be audacious to think that we can set priority and have funding sources for the upcoming budget process of 2020 for that station, but we would certainly like to see that expedited. Again, we're always willing to work with the city on this matter and willing to share our opinions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, James. Other public comment? Okay. Thank you all very much. We'll take about a 5-minute break. Our second topic is a review of the downtown public camera policy.
Well, first of all, hello. We're having a good evening. I'm Greg Burns, Lawrence Police Chief. Mayor Bowley, Commissioners, first of all, I'd like to thank you for just taking the opportunity to listen to what I believe is a very important subject that I think can assist with enhancing the public safety of downtown Lawrence. I won't bore you with rehashing everything that I spoke about last time concerning the use of public cameras back in the spring, but I will hit on some of the highlights. First I would like to remind you all how this issue of public cameras came to the forefront again in Lawrence, Kansas. It was because the day before I got sworn in as chief on October 1st of 2017, a senseless, heinous act of violence took place in downtown Lawrence that claimed the lives of 3 people and injured 2 others. And of course, questions were asked, what are you going to do? I make no bones about it. The fact that I'm a supporter of body and public cameras. I believe in trying to police smarter and not harder when it's possible. And I believe that public cameras give you the opportunity to do that. I believe as police chief that I have an obligation to try and make Lawrence a safer place to live, work, play, and learn. Public cameras are a way to not only enhance public safety, but it gives the police another tool in their toolbox to help solve crime. Cameras also act as a force multiplier because they're always working, minus any technical issues, obviously. But they're acting as an extra set of eyes. Public cameras are not a new technology in policing. In fact, the first 2 documented cases of public cameras by American police departments were in the city of Hoboken, New Jersey in 1966, and Mount Vernon, New York in 1971. The discussion first took place in our community in 2003. Some other area of Kansas police departments who utilize public cameras are the University of Kansas. They have a very large public camera system. Lenexa Police Department, Olathe Police Department, Overland Park Police Department, just to name a few. I want you to know up front, again, I respect everyone's opinion concerning public cameras and understand there will be some disagreement. I know that where there's a point, there's always a counterpoint, and that's okay. Because of whatever happens in the long run, we still have a job to do here in Lawrence, and we're going to do it. My opinion is based on 30 years of law enforcement experience and from the actual experience that I have of working with the public camera system back in 2006 in my former jurisdiction. I shared with you previously what the tipping point was of enhancing the public camera system to downtown in my former jurisdiction. It was very simple. It was one night of senseless violence that took place in 2014. that made that happen. And not only did it make it happen, it made it happen overnight. I truly believe that Lawrence has reached this tipping point. I don't think we can sit around and wait and hope another terrible incident does not happen, because I can't tell you when, but I can tell you more than likely something will happen at some point. There are several ways to operate a public camera system, which include a real-time crime center, monitoring from police dispatch, or even a camera federation, all of which are considered to be a form of active use. What I'm seeking in this community is the lowest form of camera use that you can do, which is passive use. This means that the cameras will be event-driven. No one actually watches the footage, but it is used when incidents arise and the cameras potentially hold information that may help solve a crime. The cameras may also be used in emergency situations or for the monitoring of special events. All images will be researched and retrieved, again, only if a crime is reported. Video footage will be stored for a retention period of 14 days. Then it'll be deleted. It'll go away. Again, I believe that public cameras, can assist in increasing public safety. I believe that they change behavior, or can change behavior. They can help us to catch criminals, which we can always use help in. And they can assist us in providing evidence and gathering clues, which is always vital in policing. They can also assist in arriving at the right decision. I'd like to thank you for your time, for taking to listen to what I believe is a very important subject, and I'll now take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Chief. Questions for Chief? Matthew?
In that the policy you're recommending is a passive system that's going to be monitored only reactively, is the purpose of the cameras purely for solving crimes that have already occurred, or do you anticipate it from your experience having a deterrence effect as well?
I would say that putting cameras up permanently, yes, I do expect a deterrent effect, particularly that we'll have signage stating that cameras are in use. When you have a passive system, that is, a lot of what you get is after the fact, when the crimes are committed, unless it's a situation such as the Final Four or something like that, where we're actually monitoring the cameras live, then we'll be able to follow crowds that there could be a fight in, which is something that we did this last Final Four, when we thought we may have trouble. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, you kind of led into my second question there, and part number 3 here of the policy, which is actually the policy section. It refers to specific large-scale events. It says cameras will not be monitored live by any LPD personnel as a matter of daily police operations, with the exception of specific large-scale events. And then it goes on to list examples such as you listed, the NCAA tournament. Will these specific large-scale events be made public prior to the event? In other words, will the public be made aware that we're switching from a passive system to an active system for whatever the event may be?
I think we can do that. I mean, obviously, I believe that the folks here in town know that during any NCAA run, that the camera system is being utilized in an active way. But I don't really see an issue with that.
Okay. Thank you.
Do you have any studies that show that it does act as a deterrent?
Yes. This is not a new document, but obviously this was pulled from the COPS office, which is the branch of the Department of Justice, and they listed several locations where cameras were available. Some of them were other countries. I'll tell you, for example, in Cincinnati, Ohio, they had some reductions in calls for service and antisocial behavior. They had them in different sites. They had them in 3 locations, but in the 3rd location, they had an increase in antisocial behavior. They list place in Tokyo, a reduction in vehicle crime, slight reduction in violence, substantial reduction in larceny within 50 meters of the cameras. And they list several ones. I would say from the stuff that I've seen, it's about a 50-50 toss-up. And I think that the important thing, which is what I listed in the policy, is that you audit that. So that you can judge the success in your own community. And that's something that we will be able to do, and say how many times that we've been able to pull videos that have assisted in prosecution in a crime. How many times have something been caught? How many breakdowns have we had? So all those types of things would definitely be part of the audit process.
I'd like to get a list of some of those studies, if you wouldn't mind sending them to me.
Yes, ma'am, I can give you a
Thanks.
copy of what I have.
I know that you've defined what the camera is. Are these cameras movable or zoomable?
One will be and one will not be. One type of camera is a what's called a PTZ camera. And that's for pan, tilt, zoom, which would be ones that you can move. And the second type of camera is a fixed camera. That camera would not move.
And those can be moved or zoomed remotely?
I'm sorry.
Can those be moved or zoomed remotely?
No, not the. Let me make sure I got that right. Can the fixed one be? The fixed cannot. That's what I thought.
But the pan tilt zoom can?
Yes.
Okay. And are there provisions for who's able to do that movement?
It would be members of the Technical Investigations Unit. I think I put it on that camera. And really, like I said, you really wouldn't do that. That would be more in a active viewing. Like I said, such as if we were following a crowd or something like that. Other than that, the camera would just be stationary because nobody would be controlling it.
And how detailed are the images of the cameras where they would be kind of broadly pointed, or the ones that aren't movable? Are they, you can zoom in on facial features, or are they more general, like the cameras in here?
Let me ask my specialist.
Hi, good evening. out of Beverly, run the investigation divisions, the Capitol Florence Police Department. Some of those things are specific to a model of camera, but the cameras, like the cameras in here, have the ability to point, tilt, zoom, and you can bring out features to a certain extent. Now, what we're talking about in the fixed cameras are cameras that cover a general area. As technology gets better, then you can pull out more detail, and that's not something that we drive necessarily. It's more of a, cameras get better over time. You can pull out facial features and stuff like that from some of them, but not all of them. The goal of cameras that are fixed in an area is to catch activity, action. The point of that would be ultimately to identify somebody involved in a crime, if that is in fact the task at hand on that occasion. But we don't specifically look for a model of camera that can be used for, I think where this is going, facial recognition, some of that stuff.
So none of them will be equipped with facial recognition?
So facial recognition is a software that's built. These cameras are just an appliance. That's a software that is kind of a third-party thing. This system is designed to be it's a passive monitoring system that is not attached to facial recognition. That's not what we're after in this thing right now.
Okay. And then looking at, working with other law enforcement bodies, I know that I've been approached with concerns around facial recognition technology and working with ICE, for example. How likely is that to occur?
We've had some form of cameras in the city for a number of years. If for special events like the KU Final Four events, we put those up every year to monitor those situations. The city facilities all have cameras in them that are constantly recording one way or another. University of Kansas has upwards past 700 different cameras. To my knowledge, we've not had an incident where a federal agency has come in and said, let us tap into your system. I understand the concern, but it's not something I've ever witnessed, seen, been part of, heard of in this jurisdiction.
And so approval for those kind of requests would go to you, Chief?
Would come through me.
To approve?
Would come through me to approve, and obviously, as I've listed in the policy, that those types of requests would have to be for a legitimate law enforcement purpose. It couldn't just be because we would like to, we want to, we need to. It would have to be for a purpose. And I don't really expect that I would get a lot of those types of requests. I would think that our department would mostly be, again, using them to solve crimes if a crime is reported within that time span. But at this time, I don't anticipate anything like that.
Thank you.
Would that require it to be subpoenaed if something, federal agency came and said, we would like to look at your cameras?
It wouldn't necessarily require subpoena for an agency to say that I would like to come look at your cameras, but obviously it would all be situation dependent, because if and I'll use this for an example. Obviously, if I was notified by an agency that somebody who is a serial, you fill in the blank, is supposed to be in Lawrence, Kansas, at this place, that's something that we would get involved in as law enforcement and work with them. If it was someone that was trying to authorities were trying to capture or something like that, I just don't see a lot of that. But obviously, anybody could ask.
I guess I'd like to follow up on that, because in Part 7, talking about accessibility of video images, when we talk about law enforcement outside of the LPD, only with a specific and legitimate law enforcement purpose, but that specific is not really defined under the definitions. And so I'm curious how you would view that specific and legitimate law enforcement purpose from and outside. agency?
I would view it as, it would have to be for, you know, a case. Obviously, if it's footage that is already there and we're looking through. If it was looking for a person, obviously the person would have to be wanted. They would have to be wanted on a warrant. Those are specific instances to me. Again, just because somebody would say, I would like to view your system, I would like to view your footage, just not necessarily going to happen. And obviously, I would always confer with legal if there was any question in my mind about whether it was a legitimate purpose or not.
How would these requests and decisions be documented?
The request would have to be in writing to me.
Okay.
For my approval, so they all have to be in writing.
Okay. Great.
So I would sort of know some of what they could give me on paper.
Yeah.
Do we have an idea of the scope of our downtown camera plan? I mean, what we're dealing with tonight is specific to just the actual language that will be used to administer this program, but can you give the public an idea of what we foresee going forward? Are we talking one camera on each block of Massachusetts Street, or how do you foresee this actually looking in practice?
There's a map. There's a map.
Yeah, there's a map.
Yeah, we could put the map up on the,
Yeah, I gave a map with all those locations.
Yeah, could you share that with the public is kind of where I'm going with this?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. No, my map is right here, but I had, yeah, okay. I'm looking for something else in specific.
and just for people at home.
The scope of the project would be obviously Massachusetts Street, between 6th and 11th. The coverage would be accomplished by utilizing two different types of cameras, which we talked about, the stationary camera and the pan tip zoom. The non-movable cameras with primary cover from 6th to 11th Street. And this is because there's a high volume of vehicle and pedestrian traffic. The second type, which would be the maneuverable cameras, would be primarily located between 6, I said 6 and 11, didn't I? I got a typo somewhere. 6 and 11th. Yeah, I wrote the same number down twice, but the second type will be primarily positioned between, still between 6 and 11, between the intersections.
Mid-block.
Which will provide a larger coverage of the intersections that we would use to monitor like special events such as parades and the Final Four.
And mid-block.
And the way?
Mid-block, at the crosswalks that are halfway.
Yeah, I would have, yes. From the map, you can see that's pretty, it'd be 19 cameras total. 13 locations. Yeah, 13. And what I would do would be 13 of the pan tip zoom and 6 of the fixed cameras would be utilized between these locations. And when you look at this map, obviously the circles are the regular fixed cameras. The little star thing is the pan tilt zoom cameras. And The locations, I've sort of marked them all out. Pan Tip Zoom, 6 in Mass on top of City Hall. Pan Tip Zoom, 600 block of Mass. Pan Tip Zoom, 7th in Mass on the southeast corner on light pole. 700 block of Mass, east side, top of light pole. 8th in Mass, northwest corner, top of light pole. 800 block of Mass, west side, top of light pole. 900 block of Mass, top of light pole. 10th in Mass, same thing, top of light pole. 1100 block of Massachusetts Street, west side, top of light pole. 1000 block, east side, top of light pole. 11th in Massachusetts, northeast corner. And 11th in Massachusetts, southeast corner on top of light pole. Those are all the pan tilt zoom. The fixed cameras would be at 6th and Mass Street on the traffic signal pole, 7th and Mass Street on traffic signal pole, 8th and Mass Street on traffic signal pole, 9th and Mass Street on traffic signal pole, 10th and Mass Street on the traffic signal pole, and 11th and Mass Street on the traffic signal pole. So that's sort of what the suggested setup would be.
Is there a reason that there are two in the middle of the block between 10th and 11th Street of the Pan Tilt Zoom and two at the corner of 11th and Mass?
Yeah, I sort of let, Jim, can you speak to that for me?
Hello, I'm Detective Jim Welsh. Most of these camera suggested locations are based on our experience at the Final Four and special events such as that. The combination of fixed and PTZ, we learned in 2008 that when we were moving the cameras, we often missed events that occurred in the intersections, which is where you have a high likelihood of vehicles and people coming together at certain times. So we wanted fixed cameras that showed those no matter which direction the PTZs were facing. We often, especially in the Final Four, our largest crowds are in the 1000 block, and that's why we wanted the coverage there. And then the 11th and Mass, the reason there's two PTZs there is it would allow us to shoot further south, closer to the crosswalk between South Park and such, if we need to cover those areas as well.
Other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have conversation up here on this topic?
What was that?
Do we have conversation up here on this topic before we turn it over to public comment? Okay. Public comment on this issue.
Hello, my name is Brian Thomas. I'm here representing Lawrence Democratic Socialists of America. I've got a prepared statement. Unfortunately, I did not have time to print it, so I'll have to read it off my phone. The proposed surveillance system is another example of how the profit motive is driving our criminal justice policy. This policy would not serve the interests of the people of Lawrence, but would put $108,000 into the pockets of a private company who's selling us the cameras. We saw this same process last year when private jail construction companies wanted our city and state to build a jail we don't want and don't need. Private companies always want to expand the incarceration system to line their pockets, and this vicious cycle has propelled a brutal and racist system of mass incarceration. We've seen this before. Police will purchase more tools to catch more people for minor offenses, and then they use the rise in minor convictions to justify buying more tools and building more prisons. We said no to the jail expansion, and we say no to the expansion of the mass incarceration apparatus. As socialists and residents of Lawrence, we reject this proposal and urge everyone to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kirsten Kuhn, Broken Arrow neighborhood. The Douglas County Libertarians are opposed to the permanent installation of security cameras along Massachusetts Street. Although we have submitted a statement previously, we do not feel as if our concerns have been addressed. There are still serious issues which must not be ignored. Although we acknowledge a reduced right to privacy in public space, the installation of additional cameras is unreasonable. Local businesses and several city cameras monitor the area already. Additional cameras do not, will not, and cannot prevent crime. At best, they may assist in the investigation. The triple homicide was an isolated occurrence. Aside from that, it appears the last murder en masse was in 2006. We also suspect the alleged potential deterrent effect of cameras is not necessarily applicable to this area. As we've mentioned before, someone may commit crime regardless of cameras if they're so drunk they aren't thinking about consequences. The goal should be to address root causes of crime and to allocate resources where there is the largest return on investment. Furthermore, claims have been made that a policy of this nature would simply push crimes outside the monitored areas. This could mean more dispersed crime, but not necessarily a decrease. There are other areas in the city which have issues with crime. That would seem to indicate that part of the reason for this camera deployment is public relations. If our interest is in reducing crime, there are other areas, and more importantly, other methods we should focus on. Even a perfectly drafted policy is still vulnerable to abuse. Although individual appearances on camera may be equivalent to something that is publicly observable, the ability to track someone from place to place would be called stalking if done physically. We have concerns about what kind of monitoring can be done to understand if the data has been accessed improperly, whether internally or externally, and what the outcomes would be if this were to occur. The ACLU has found these sorts of systems are quite susceptible to fraud and misuse. They state, quote, "Once installed, surveillance systems rarely remain confined to their original purpose, have little impact on public safety, and have a chilling effect on public life. Lawrence has always prided itself on being a leader when it comes to civil liberties and supporting its downtown businesses. This initiative deviates from that narrative. Of a more specific and concerning nature, the language allows for 5-year retention of data for criminal cases, 5 years for internal affairs investigations, and indefinitely for more violent and serious offenses. It is concerning to us that data regarding citizen complaints against officers is only retained for 3 years. The city is intent on creating this policy and a category of data to be retained indefinitely. We insist that this include allegations of officer misconduct. Barring that, it should be retained for at least 5 years, commensurate with the duration the police impose upon the citizenry, or 7 years, equal to the retention of the use of force data. While we understand the Commission's and community's concern for safety in Lawrence, we still do not support this initiative. The bottom line is that cameras will not make us safer, but they will make us less free and cost the city more money. Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor and Commissioners. My name is Katie Walsh, 732 Rhode Island. And I wanted to echo the concerns you mentioned that some of your constituents had mentioned to you about ICE. And Chief Burns did say that if information about a crime or was requested from another agency, it would have to be a written request. But I sure don't want us cooperating with ICE on deportations, etc., unless there is someone who has committed a heinous crime. I just think we might need a policy on that. So thank you.
Thank you, too. Other public comment? Well, I believe that's probably it. We've already adjourned. We've had all our public comment on this issue. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.